Let me begin with this for those who don't bother to read the show notes before downloading this sucker. Perhaps you're driving along the highway somewhere and just started punching infotainment buttons without reading anything, and you shouldn't read while you drive, so I don't blame you at all for doing that. I've done it myself, not that I drive much these days, being a Cyclops. This is your garden variety trigger warning. I rarely label, or perhaps never have labeled the show as being explicit, and it generally isn't because I'm careful with my language for the most part. I do not speak on the microphone exactly as freely with the old New Jersey dialect as I would in real life. By that, I mean cuss words, but I would like to warn those who do get upset by strong language that late in the hour, I did get a little worked up in my commentary and utilized what we in baseball refer to as the magic word, the word that, if a manager directs it towards an umpire, will get him run from the game. Yes, it is the descriptor that refers to having connubial relations with one's immediate maternal ancestor. Now, it would have been very easy for me to lift a pinky and say, "Oh no, I have transgressed," and erased it or re-recorded that dialogue in a calmer way. But I think it's totally appropriate to the subject at hand. And knowing you for as long as I have, I expect you'll agree, so it's going to stay as is. But if you have a young, impressionable child with you and you don't want the child to whip that word out when the teacher says something rude in class, my point of view is that teachers shouldn't say anything rude to our children in class, so you can't have it both ways. But that's probably not good advice, and you probably shouldn't take it. No need for your child to end up in the principal's office for word crimes as often as I did. On only one occasion did that involve swearing, and it was a very calculated thing that I did, but that's a story for another day. For now, I have other tales to tell, so consider yourself duly warned, and let's move on. Here comes the trolley. Let's take it into the world of the real we call the infinite inning. This story has a baseball bat in it, but it isn't a baseball story. Last week, I was looking through the Kansas City papers for stories about William Bell, a great Negro Leagues pitcher who was with the Kansas City Monarchs from 1923 to 1930. As so often happens when I go hunting for fun or moving baseball stories to tell you about, I found other threads of American history, raw, bleeding threads. There weren't too many mentions of the pitcher, William Bell, just a few allusions to him in brief game stories, but I also found this from October 10th, 1924. Innocent man, victim of Chicago mob belief. The story begins, belief that the mob that early today beat to death William Bell, a Negro, killed an innocent man, was expressed tonight by police working on the case. The dead man was suspected of having attempted to attack one of two white girls, but neither could identify Bell as the assailant. Bell was beaten with a baseball bat, kicked and trampled when the screams of Betty Greenblatt and Bertha Deutsch brought a crowd of youths from a nearby soft drink parlor. I knew this wasn't the William Bell I was looking for. You can find more about him in the Dead Player of the Day series over at Patreon. He's in Series 2, Number 8. But I still felt it was important to understand what happened. And as best I can tell you, nearly 102 years later, and there is a lot of my interpretation here based on piecing together a whole lot of primary sources, a couple of young women, Miss Bertha Deutsch, 21 years old, of 1357 Miller Street in Chicago, a stenographer employed by the Board of Assessors, and Miss Betty Greenblatt, 1071 Miller Street, a typist for F. Lewald and Company of 3066 South Franklin Street, Chicago, were talking on the street in front of Miss Deutsch's home, having just arrived from work. Now, right there, that's where I stopped being 100% certain about the story. That's the only part that remains consistent, despite later testimony which contradicted everything else. This story got so twisted up, I don't really know how to tell it, but here's my guess. So the two women were standing on the street. Two white men drove up in a Ford and started chatting up the two women, probably in a lascivious way. One of them propositioned Betty Greenblatt, asking her to go for a ride. Now, maybe it was innocent, maybe it wasn't. I don't think it was. I think going for a ride was a metaphor for some other more biological activity. You'd better go ahead on, she said, meaning no. When the man said, he wasn't leaving, she said, if you don't, you'll wish you had. Well, they still didn't go. She walked across the street to what they called back then a sacramental wine store. See, it was prohibition, so you couldn't call a tavern, a bar, a liquor store, a liquor store. You had to claim an exemption saying you were selling alcohol for medicinal or religious purposes. It was, of course, bull, and this store was a kind of bar. It was a place where people would stand around and get drunk. That's how out in the open it was. It wasn't like people were coming with a pail and taking whatever they sold home, and then they would get drunk in private out of view of the police. No, they were just there in the open, and maybe the police had been paid. Maybe no one cared because a lot of cities had decided they weren't going to enforce this because it was dumb. Maybe the plan was if a police car rolled up, you just ran away. It was every man for himself, and once the hubbub had died down, you opened up again. Any of those things are possible. So Betty Greenblatt goes across the street to where all these fellas are drinking and points to the two guys in the Ford. And I don't know what she said or didn't say, but the sacramental wine drinkers, for want of a better term, start getting up off the stoop and heading across the street. One of them, Otto Epstein, a watchman at the store, and also the guy selling the booze at the moment, takes a second to pick up a baseball bat before he heads on over. Now, at this point in the story, the two guys in the white Ford just vanish. Poof! They're just not in this movie anymore, this real-life movie. It's as if there's a cut and they just vanish. Entering in their place are two African-American men who are extremely ill-timed and unfortunate in their arrival on the block. Maybe they'd been there all along. They might have been. They might have just been standing on the corner chatting. One of them, the namesake of our Kansas City Monarchs pitcher, was William Bell, a man in his, say, 20s or early 30s, a married man, for what that's worth, and a friend of his, Albert Hall, also a baseball name, the name, sadly, of a major league player, a Braves outfielder of the 1980s, someone who always used to make me think of the Beatles song A Day in the Life. He passed away, unfortunately, just this last December, I'm sorry to say. The Albert Hall of this story, the Albert Hall of 100 years ago, found himself, as I said, in the wrong place at the wrong time, as did William Bell. Rather than running up to two white guys in a Ford who were propositioning these two women, and by the by, if a lot of the names in this story sound Jewish, it does seem that this was, at the time, a Jewish neighborhood. I'm sorry to say, Jews are like everybody else. You have your fantastic people, and you have some people who are less exemplary, and that's true of every human sample you might try to take, whether you're looking at nationality, religion, creed, place of origin, whatever. Every group is an average. You go from high to low and settle somewhere in the middle in terms of the group as a whole. So the fellas from the wine shop, led by Otto Epstein, rather than confronting two white men in this Ford, who might or might not have still been there, my guess is they got out of Dodge when they saw this mob forming, decide they're going to confront the two black guys on the scene. They go rushing up to, well, first Albert Hall. Epstein says, according to Hall, "What are you looking for?" And before Hall can answer, Epstein punches him in the face. He goes down. Looking up, he sees Epstein switch a baseball bat from his left hand to his right hand and swing it at William Bell's skull, connecting. To his later shame, Hall fled, leaving Bell at the mercy of a crowd that had ballooned to 200 people. He was already down on the ground, Bell, with a fractured skull. I quote, "The crowd, constantly growing, stormed around him. Blows and kicks were aimed at him, and some of the men in the crowd trampled on him as he lay on the ground. By the time the police arrived and restored order, Bell was dead. The coroner later said the fracture, the skull fracture, inflicted by Epstein and his baseball bat, had been the fatal blow." Now, at this point, they have a coroner's inquest, and everybody involved has to testify. When Betty and Bertha are called up, they edit the story quite a bit. What they say is that they were standing on the street, a black man wearing a light cap and a dark suit approached Betty, showed them some money, and made an insulting remark. She didn't mention Hall. She said she made no reply to that man, and then screamed and fled into Bertha's home. She didn't say anything about summoning a mob. She didn't mention the two white men in the car. until an attorney for Bell's brother asked about it, saying that they had witnesses placing those two white men in the Ford at the scene. "I forgot to mention that," she replied. When taken to the morgue and asked to identify William Bell as the man who had, quote, insulted them, she said she wasn't sure. Maybe it was him, maybe not. Same thing with Bertha Deutsch. The police, who you'd think would have been happy to take the two women at their word and just close the case, if at all possible, gathered up all their witness statements and formally concluded that Bell had nothing to do with this. Epstein was arrested for his murder. This is pure supposition on my part, but what I imagine is that Bertha Deutsch lived across the street from the, quote, Sacramento wine shop, the liquor store, or the bar. Betty didn't live too far away either. All these people share the same neighborhood. Those two women have to live in it. So when the mob went off and killed the wrong person, it seems likely to me that someone must have said to the two young women, look, just a alibi for those guys. They meant well. They were trying to protect your honor, weren't they? But when it came to actually testifying under oath, they found themselves having to perjure themselves again and again and became reluctant to do it, hence the refusal to identify Bell as the person who had approached them. Bell's murder was supposedly the only lynching to take place in Chicago during the age of anti-black violence that was centered in a period from roughly the 1880s to around the 1920s, though you could argue with that definition due to the murder of a poor black kid for the crime of swimming and crossing an invisible whites-only barrier that touched off major riots in Chicago during the so-called Red Summer of 1919. I believe we've talked about that during a prior episode. You can probably guess where the rest of this is going to go. Epstein went on trial the next year. His attorney played the racist fearmonger over and over again, warning the jury of a beast who insulted our white women. His client was found not guilty, even though several witnesses identified him as the man with the bat who had hit William Bell in the head. Now, this all happened a long time ago, but it seems worth asking if we are the sort of country that tolerated or tolerates this kind of thing. When informed of the lynching, then Chicago Mayor William Dever said that such a thing should happen in a city like Chicago is deplorable. I am sorry and I regret very much that it had to happen. The man, if guilty, should have been arrested and kept in a safe place. Meaning Bell, not Epstein. And what I would ask him, were I there? Guilty of what? That's the question. Who in this story deserved to die? And if so, to die for what crime? For being rude to a woman on the street? Soliciting prostitution? Harassment? Sexual or otherwise? Whether that was Bell or the two white guys in the Ford or some other black guy, as Epstein later testified. Damn it, I got the wrong black guy. Whatever those crimes were, if any, those are not capital crimes. And of course, they are crimes that should be adjudicated in a court of law and not by the local drunken bar bouncer acting as judge, jury, and executioner. No one in this tale should have been subject to summary execution on the street. William Bell, namesake of the Negro Leagues pitcher, was murdered during the World Series between the Washington Senators and the New York Giants, and a little before the other World Series, starring the other William Bell pitching for the Monarchs against the Hilldale Club. They won it too, the Monarchs. They were champions of the Negro Leagues that year. But as I said earlier, this is not a baseball story, despite there being a bat in it. It is, however, an American story. And baseball is an American story, and so in the end, perhaps you can't take one without the other. The ghost of William Bell walks. Both William Bells. Ask them how they feel about it, if you run into them, inside or outside, the unfriendly confines that we call the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 360 in an ongoing series. I remain your congenial, your convivial host, Stephen Goldman, on this journey to better understand the present via a trip to the past, the time machine being, as ever, but not exclusively, the game of baseball. I hope that this episode finds you well. You might hear me. I'm still a bit congested from whatever the heck it is that hit me last week. I'll tell you, I've been sicker. Seems like tempting fate to say that, but I tested negative for COVID. I tested negative for 2 flavors of flu. So this was some kind of cold sinus infection sort of thing. My fever never got that high. I never got that congested, but I was 2-fisting tissues. And I'm a writer. I need access to my keyboard, or for that matter, to be able to speak on this microphone without drowning in goo. And I'm sorry if that sounds disgusting. It was for me, and I was living inside of it. And at some point, I gave up. I said, you know what? The sinus pressure hurts so much I can't think straight. I can't type more than 3 words in a row without having to stop and, mop up, essentially, try to clear the pipes. And if I stay down here where my office is, which is also where my family circulates, I'm going to make them all terribly ill as well. And there was no point. So I went to bed, and I hid in my bedroom for 3 days, stayed separate from my wife, took my meals alone, and just tried to get better. And I was just on the verge of saying, it's not getting better. I called my doctor, I got some antibiotics, and as soon as they showed up, the fever broke. I stopped having to blow my nose as often, and I started gradually returning to life. But what's frustrating is, whereas the acute part seems to be over, there are still aspects of this that are lingering. And all winter we've heard, watch out for that flu that's jailbreaking the vaccinations. They put the wrong strain in there this year. A lot of people winding up in the hospital. You don't want that. You don't want to get COVID, in my case, for a second time. I know people who have had more cases of it than that. I was really fortunate. And yet, this also sucked really badly. And maybe it wasn't threatening to kill me that I know of, but it certainly made me miserable and continues to immiserate life in a minor way. I feel like I might have to subscribe to the Kleenex of the Month Club. And I'm not complaining about this in the sense that I was prevented from getting to work. It's not about inconvenience, but just as I was getting back in the saddle here, my mother became ill and required a stay in the hospital, which is, as we speak, ongoing. And I think she's getting on the good side of what afflicted her, or afflicts her, present tense. It's not my story to tell, so I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. But as you know, I lost my dad about, a year and a half ago now. So Mom, who's in her 80s, is on her own, and it falls to me and my wife primarily to look out for her. And through no fault of her own, she got into some trouble, as we all sometimes do. She got into some trouble. Sounds like you robbed the wrong people, Mom, and now they're out for revenge. No, it's just one of those things that happen where part of your body goes back on you, and you got to see if you can, get out of that. And I think she is. I think she is getting out of it. It's just that it's more time away, and it's the right time. As you know, I'm not a religious man, but honor thy father and mother, I do think that is the right advice. And I do, and did. As Mel Brooks sings in High Anxiety, remember, folks, be good to your parents. They've been good to you. Now, have they been perfect to you? No, but no one is. No one has been. I don't think you can name a person in your life, no matter how much they love you, no matter how much you love them, that you haven't screwed it up at some point, and they haven't screwed it up at some point. The problem is that our parents are such important figures in our life that when they mess up, it takes on such an outsized importance. It really is important. Maybe there is no such thing as outsized when it comes to your parents. And of course, I'm talking about parents above the replacement level. PARP? I'm talking about PARPs, because there are, unfortunately, all sorts of toxic parents who do things that we would describe in one form or another as abusive. I'm not talking about that. That's a whole other category. I'm talking about mistakes that we all make in the course of simply being human. And I know I found when I first became a dad a long time ago that I was still me. I was the me that I was the moment before I was a dad. The instant before my first child was born, I was, the person I was at that moment, and the same was true the moment after. No fund of knowledge came raining into my brain. I didn't suddenly upload anything. I had to figure it out. And from my own parents, I had some examples that I rather liked and emulated, and a few things that I didn't like so much. And I said, we're going to leave that with them. We're not going to repeat that with my kids. Not things that were bad or toxic in any way, just things that I thought were suboptimal that didn't seem to be consistent with the identity I imagined for myself as a parent and what I thought would be productive. Now, is that a comment on my parents' overall parenting? No, because I made mistakes of my own. They had their batting average and I had mine. And having had that experience, it allowed me to let go for the most part. I can still make myself mad about these things sometimes. Even with my dad, for example, gone, there's no argument I can have with him now. Those arguments that remain unsettled are forever going to be that way. And there's some of them that I might not ever understand what his point of view was, or why he did what he did, or why my mother has strengths in this area and flaws in that area that might have affected me. Both affected me. But I realized once I became a parent myself that they did the best that they could with the tools that they had, and tools could include their own upbringing, their personalities, their native intelligence. I don't know, that they read Dr. Spock. I mean, a lot of things. And I know that they were always well-intentioned. And having in my own life, in parenting and in other areas, been both well-intentioned and inept, I was able to just let most of it go. There are still a few places where I wish that my father could have been a little more flexible in his thinking than he was capable of being. There are times and places where I wish my mom could have been more present. But to the extent that I was ever angry about those things, that's all in the past now. And folks, this is all my long-winded way of explaining why I didn't do my podcast homework last week, and I do hope that you'll forgive me. As ever, I'm going to keep trying to stay on this tightrope. I also missed one entry over at Patreon in the Dead Player of the Day series. I had warned you that that might be the case when we started out on Series 2. I just didn't know it would happen this soon. I'm not sure where I left off in telling you what players I had done, so if I repeat something here, please forgive me. But for those keeping score at home or looking forward to having one player or another turn up, I mean, first of all, I thought it was only 100 players. I left off in Series 1 at 193, So if your favorite player has not come up yet, well, possibly he was part of Series 1, so go in and take a look for that. A number of them were not behind the paywall, so you might be able to turn them up. Others were original to the Infinite Inning book, still available at Amazon, which revises and expands a number of them from Series 1. I don't know if I'll do that again or not. But since we last met in these hallowed halls, well, you've already heard that I did the Kansas City Monarchs pitcher William Bell. That was followed, or he was followed, I should say, by White Sox great Thornton Lee, followed by outfielder George Washington, the other George Washington, the very light-hitting catcher Bill Bergen, the best center fielder in Washington Senators history, Clyde Milan, the recent, not a dead player, but he came up when I hit random, so I did him, Enrique Wilson, the recent infielder, and finally, the controversial at the time Tigers pitcher Joe Sparma. And if I ever do find myself revising and expanding this series for book purposes, Sparma might be one of the first guys I go back to, because it's rare to see a pitcher who so annoyed his managers with his intransigence, his inability to find something consistent in terms of command and control, that they popped off to the press in no uncertain terms. I didn't get into all of that. I just did a little bit because these are supposed to be fairly quick player comments, but almost in spite of myself, they turn into mini essays. And functionally, it turns out that the time invested is about the same regardless, because the time is in the learning, not in the writing. Unless, not to call your attention back to this, but, tissues. I know in Sparma's day, this is the late 60s, it was much more common for managers to rip players in the press, although that was already going the way of the dinosaur at that time. But even John McGraw never said anything like, what am I supposed to do with that guy? I can't pitch him, but I can't shoot him. Doesn't that shock you? It shocked me. Very briefly, I did get a story in at Baseball Prospectus this week. It was a quick reaction to the announcement of the Hall of Fame voting. I'm not going to belabor that too much here. I am happy to see Carlos Beltran and Andruw Jones go in about 98.3% happy. And the other part is about hypocrisy, about the ways that people have portrayed the voting and the sanctity of the hall and so on over all the years of voting. And maybe our thinking has evolved, or maybe we just moved the goalposts because we were never that serious about the goalposts to begin with. I tend to subscribe to that point of view more than I do the others, but it's not all of one thing. And now, having said that, we are vastly overdue as ever for a break. My whole life is about being vastly overdue for some deadline or another, but I'm in there punching, and I don't intend to quit anytime soon. On the other side, I want to go back to a player I mentioned a few moments ago, Clyde Millan. Something happened to him early on, in fact, at the very start of his minor league career, that threatened to knock him back before he had even started. And though that aspect of his story took place 121 years ago, it is still very relevant to our present day lives. And so I hope you will stay with me on the other side of Break Valley, when we will take not the last train to Clarksville, but the first train out of Clarksville. So during the break, I took a moment, I'm not sure why, it just kind of happened, to watch and listen to the version of Tom Waits' God's Away on Business, which someone very cleverly synced up with footage of the Cookie Monster, whose voice is not all that dissimilar to peak Tom Waits. This video is years old. It may be as old as YouTube at this point, but I never get bored of it. And I never get bored of Tom Waits either, with or without Cookie Monster. And it just seems like such an appropriate song for a moment when, as I speak to you now, everywhere east of the Mississippi, it seems, the sky is pregnant with over a foot of snow, potentially, depending on where you are. And even if you're not going to get a foot of snow, then you might get ice or sleet or something else equally dangerous. There is a chance of power failures in areas where ice piles up on those power lines and snaps them. And I just very much hope that all of you stay safe and warm, stay off the roads if at all possible. Hey, listen to old Infinite Innings. I'm not trying to be mercenary about this. I'm just saying, if I can help you pass the time if you are snowed in, then please pull on a blanket and dial up some company. It doesn't even have to be me. It can be someone else in the podcast space. It can be Cookie Monster / Tom Waits. And one other thing, this is really important. For those of you who are not in mint cardiac condition, not in mint, spinal condition, and maybe even if you're both, don't rush out and try to heave all of 1.5 feet of snow off your driveway in one go. Maybe not any go. So many people get in trouble this way. It's not the storm that gets them, it's the aftermath. I'm not saying you have to wait till spring, until the thaw. But just be smart about this. And if you need help, ask for it. Don't take any chances if you have any questions, because often it's too late to ask them after the fact. And at the risk of scaring you, I'll tell you who I wish had handled that kind of thing differently. It's the fellow we're about to talk about, Washington Senators center fielder Clyde Millan, who stayed in baseball for the rest of his life and was a Senators coach for forever. Well, spring training 1953, he'd been having chest pains. And he's down in Florida at Senators camp, Bradenton, I think it was. And he went out on a warm morning, hit a whole bunch of fly balls and a whole bunch of grounders. And, well, I don't want to milk the story. His heart couldn't take it. and he came off the field in dire shape and passed away about 2 hours later. If you have any indication that your arteries look less like a brand new, pristine tunnel through a mountain, 4 lanes wide and lit by bright white lights, and more like something Gollum would have crawled through after he lost the one ring, then please don't shovel and get checked out, because we want you around. We can't spare you here at the Infinite Inning. You know how if you ride the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland or Disney World, the narrator, was it Paul Frees, says that we have 999 ghosts, but there's always room for one more? The Infinite Inning already has 1,000 ghosts. Over 1,000 ghosts. And we're not planning on adding an annex. So no, we don't want you in here right now. So, as I've already said a number of times this last week over at Patreon, I wrote up Washington Senators center fielder, best center fielder in Washington Senators history, which lasted almost exactly 60 years, Clyde Millan, who played in the majors from 1907 through 1922. Very good player, 40 career WAR guy. He was, as his .285 batting average, .353 on base percentage, and .353 slugging percentage suggest, not to mention his nearly 500 stolen bases, a pesky player. Now, usually pesky means a weak hitter, but we have to say something nice, so we'll compare him to a gnat, because we're not really paid to be creative. Now, Millan was a light hitter in our sense, but a good one, and one of the best base stealers of his day. For a couple of years, he had the AL single-season record for steals. He took it from Ty Cobb. After a couple of years, Cobb took it back, and it remained with him for the rest of his life until Rickey Henderson came along a couple of decades after his life ended. But of course, anyone can be a leadoff hitter. It just depends how the manager decides to use you, and the reverse is true. Although Millan sounds like a leadoff type guy, and he did lead off a lot, the Senators also batted him third a ton. I don't know if that was the best use of him, but I don't think it hurt them either, especially during the dead ball years. Again, this was a player who slugged .353 for his career. And for me, the best baseball always being the baseball that existed when you were a young adolescent, for me, the quintessential number 3 hitter is Don Mattingly. A number 3 hitter should hit .350 with 45 doubles and 30 home runs, few strikeouts if possible. But back then, there were many players who were below 400, never mind over 500. If you look at the major leagues from 1901 through 1919, after which the lively ball came in, and ask how many players who got at least 1,000 plate appearances in the number 3 spot in the batting order had slugging percentages over 500, you get two players who were over 500, Ty Cobb and Shoeless Joe. There were another 4 who were above 450. On the other end, 29 hitters, or over half, who were under 500. Millan had only the 16th lowest slugging percentage, so his being used in the number 3 spot wasn't just the Senators being weird. You know who was on the high side for the period, by the way? Casey Stengel, number 3 hitter for the Dodgers. Now, since the ball got some life to it, we've only had the occasional pure singles sub 400 slugging percentage guy in the number 3 spot. Hitters like Tommy Herr and Willie McGee with the Cardinals, and Julio Franco with the Rangers and other teams. Even they're getting to be a long time ago now. In this century, the only hitters to routinely slug under 400 in the number 3 spot were Brandon Phillips, Doug Minkiewicz, Elvis Andrus, Kyle Seager, and Nathaniel Lowe. Seager's a weird one. He was a far more robust hitter than that. He just really struggled when he batted third. Batting 4th or 5th, he was roughly who he was on a career basis. He hit .250, .328, .455, something like that approximately. But in 1,300 plate appearances batting third, he hit .224, .300, .397. There's no real reason for it. It could just all be bad luck or something psychological. I don't know. But we were talking about Clyde Millan. Clyde Millan, the second largest city in Italy, home of the famed Chicken Milanese. You can visit it. The Chicken Milanese, as opposed to a Chicken Milanese. You can sit next to the famous chicken while taking in a performance of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Starlight Express at the famous La Scala Opera House. Or so I've heard. In 1905, Millan was a teenager, just 18 years old, and he was playing for Clarksville in the North Texas League. You know the Clarksville in the Monkees' #1 hit, Last Train to Clarksville? which might or might not have referred to a jumping off point for soldiers about to head over to Vietnam. I thought it might be that Clarksville, because that Clarksville is in Tennessee, and it's tempting to think that it would be that Clarksville because Milan was from Tennessee, and players back then usually started out close to home. There wasn't a draft. It wasn't like you were taken out of the University of whatever and then transported to the Miami Marlins farm system wherever their far-flung outposts happened to be. No, you went out for the local 9 as best you could. Last episode, I believe we were talking about Billy Martin. Billy Martin was from Berkeley. Who did he try to catch on with when he turned professional? The Oakland Oaks. More applicable to this time period, almost exactly the same time period, Ty Cobb from Georgia. What was his first minor league team? The Augusta Tourists. Cobb was born December 1886. Milan was born March 1887, so about 3.5 months apart. Alas, no, you are spared a huge digression into the catalog of Boyce and Hart, the key Monkees songwriters, along with Neil Diamond, because it was not that Clarksville. This was Clarksville, Texas, and it was Milan's first professional opportunity. He had a lifelong wish to be a major leaguer. What would he be when he grew up? A baseball player. He really did dream about that, even though he was at a bit of a handicap because he seemed to have grown up in the one place in turn of the 20th century America where there wasn't a whole lot of baseball being played. When you think of players who came to baseball late, and one of the quintessential examples of this for me is always 1980s second baseman and outfielder, sort of, Juan Samuel, because he did not play the game from when he was a little kid. He came to it later. And so though he had all the physical tools in the world, the finer points of the game tended to elude him. Thus, he didn't walk much. He struck out a ton for the time, and he was pretty rough at any position you might try him at. And that's because there was some part of him that had missed these foundational reps and could never catch up. The football players that came into baseball in the 80s and 90s, incredibly talented athletes like Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders, also showed that rawness quite often because as soon as football season rolled around, they threw down their bats and put on pads. And I don't begrudge them their choice of doing that. It's just that, again, there was a refinement that was missing. You know, I've often joked on this show about how unathletic I am, and I did come to actually playing baseball late. I never played it in an organized way, just with my friends or in small kind of pickup teams around town. And when I was 14 or 15, I was pretty excited to do that and to get better because I didn't have the skill level of a 14 or 15-year-old. I had the skill level of some kind of orphaned woodland animal. And then I remember reading for the first time Babe Ruth's farewell speech from 1948 when he said, "As a rule, some people think if you give them a football or a baseball or something like that, naturally they're athletes right away. But you can't do that in baseball. You've got to start from way down at the bottom when you're 6 or 7 years of age. You can't wait until you're 15 or 16. And I'm sitting there reading that, and I am 15, and I'm only just starting, and I think, damn it. Milan was a bit like that, but his game was contained enough, and the major league game was primitive enough, so much less refined than it is today, that he was eventually able to catch up. He hit 304 full seasons. He led the American League in stolen bases a couple of times, and his reputation as a base stealer was huge. He was known to play a very good center field defensively. Some people said he played shallower than Tris Speaker, which allowed him to steal a lot of hits. He scored 100 runs a couple of times. This was a very good precision-style baseball player, which is really the antithesis of a Juan Samuel or a Bo Jackson, who had some of the same disadvantages. And if you look at Milan's baseball card, you can see that he had to make adjustments upon reaching the major leagues. He really struggled, particularly in his second full season, and it seemed like his major league career might end soon after it started, but he played himself back into a job and then held it for the next dozen years. He had 3 top 10 MVP finishes in that period as well. In 1905, he was just beginning that transformation, his first chance to press the scouts, climb the ladder. Now, the North Texas League was a 4-team league, small local circuit, with the clubs in the aforementioned Clarksville, Greenville, Texarkana, and then there was one club that split the season between two towns, Paris and Hope. They were, very helpfully for our purposes, called the Parasites. The Paris Parasites. That would turn out to be too cute by half. See, now we have to talk about a different sort of pesky and a different sort of parasites, because that name was tempting fate. That summer, the North Texas League, and other chunks of the South as well, was hit by an epidemic of yellow fever. That is a virus that used to be a big problem in all of the United States, but the southern United States in particular. It's transmitted by a mosquito, that wonderful little varmint that, along with the existence of viruses themselves, must force even the most religious among us to question God's motives. You know, the hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful goes back to the 1840s in Britain. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, he made their glowing colors, he made their tiny wings. Monty Python, in the form of Eric Idle, did a version of that called All Things Dull and Ugly, that in some senses is the most pointed thing he ever did or they ever did. All things dull and ugly, all creatures short and squat, all things rude and nasty, the Lord God made the lot. Each little snake that poisons, each little wasp that stings, he made their brutish venom, he made their horrid wings, all things sick and cancerous, all evil, great and small, all things foul and dangerous. The Lord God made them all. Thank you, Eric Idle. But he's testing us. What, like we test lab rats? As I seem to recall, one of the Pythons, the late Terry Jones, I think, said of their film, The Life of Brian, that it wasn't blasphemous, it was heretical, which is different, and their point is also my point. They're similar. I feel like this is sort of awkward timing, but I've got to test your patience now with a break. The second and last of the episode, so if you will just hang with me during this brief intermission, as I always say, on the other side, I will talk a bit about what yellow fever was and is, and how that intersected with the life and times of baseball outfielder Clyde Milan. I look forward to seeing you on the other side. Again, stay safe and warm until then, okay? Yellow fever and the American experience are old pals. The bug chased the federal government out of Philadelphia in the 1790s. In 1793, in his biography of George Washington, James Thomas Flexner described the moment like this, and I really recommend that book. It's a multi-volume biography, but the one-volume version, which is called The Indispensable Man, is still great. He wrote, "No one then understood how yellow fever was transmitted. Unsuspected by science, mosquitoes took over Philadelphia. In August 1793, the disease moved on insect wings down the street from the waterfront, creating the most murderous epidemic in all American history. Hamilton was soon believed to be dying. Those still living inhabitants who had not fled the city cowered indoors. The principal movement on the streets being of open carts driven by blacks, Negroes were considered immune, on which sprawled corpses being hurried to the pits, which had taken over from the glutted graveyards. The presidential office, Washington wrote, was in a manner blockaded by the disorder. Yet word came to him that his presence in the city was one of the few things that gave inhabitants hope. Although he had announced a date for his departure for a Mount Vernon holiday, he decided to remain. However, Martha could not be persuaded to leave without him. Unwilling to expose her and the children to the contagion, he agreed to leave, but not one day sooner than he had previously intended. Perhaps 5,000 people died in Philadelphia during the 1793 epidemic, but with record-keeping back then being an imprecise thing, who really knows? Just keep in mind, the whole city was about 50,000 in population at that time, so today, if they lost the same percentage to some sort of illness, they'd bury maybe 150,000 people. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th century, we started draining swamps pell-mell and spraying DDT everywhere, which reduced the mosquito population, and the outbreaks began to die down. A vaccine came around in the late 1920s, and it wasn't all that safe or easy to make at the beginning, but it was improved over the next couple of decades. A South African doctor named Max Theiler picked up the 1951 Nobel Prize in Medicine for developing the shot. Probably it should have gone to our current president, who at 5 years old was already understood by himself to be the Messiah, but Theiler was selfish and never turned it over. Now, it's great for us here today that happened, but it came far too late to spare thousands of Americans who had to suffer through epidemics of yellow fever, or yellow jack as it was sometimes called, not all of whom made it out the other side. New Orleans was always particularly afflicted. It has a sub-equatorial climate, and they used to have an outbreak every year. There's a Bette Davis film from 1938 that shows up on Turner Classic sometimes, Jezebel, in which the yearly die-off is part of the story. I don't mean to refer to that lightly. It's 1852, and Bette Davis is a spoiled brat of a New Orleans belle who gets into a pointless spat with her fiancé, played by Henry Fonda. Hank, by the way, one of my favorite actors, but he looks like he has no idea what he's doing there. So he breaks off the engagement, and that would be that. But then the fever comes for him, and there's no more time for games. Now, that's true to history, because the 1853 outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans murdered something like 8,000 or 9,000 people. Yellow Jack was culpable for about half the total mortality in the city that year. A regional outbreak in 1878 might have killed as many as 20,000 people, and so snarled the economy of that part of the country that it basically shut down. There were some travel restrictions, so goods weren't moving. There were shotgun quarantine lines around some towns. And although it wasn't like COVID, when we were just told, hey, quarantine, stay home, people did anyway, in large part because they didn't know how yellow jack was transmitted. They just knew if they went out that somehow they'd catch it. It didn't work because if they didn't go out to meet the mosquito would invite herself over. And I say herself because it's always a herself when it comes to biting. What did Miss Mosquito bring them? Well, in a lot of cases, something that they might survive, though the process of letting one's immune system work through that thing wasn't fun, with fever and chills and pain and vomiting, all the greatest hits of disease. And if your system couldn't beat it, it went to the liver, and it would slice and dice, causing jaundice, hence the yellow part. And then you started vomiting blood, and, well, you were on your way off the planet. Allow me to quote briefly from The American Plague, The Untold Story of Yellow Fever, The Epidemic That Shaped Our History by Molly Caldwell Crosby. The flies had been swarming around the house for days. As he walked the exterior, he tried to peer into the boarded windows where flies crawled through starbursts of broken glass. Shielding his eyes with cupped hands, he could not see anything through the black splinters of darkness but a gray, dim light. He had no name, at least not one that survived in the family records. He was an old slave who continued to live with the Angevine family as a servant long after he had been legally freed. The family owned a 4,000-acre farm outside of Grenada, Mississippi, where Mrs. Angevine had been born and raised before marrying a New York attorney and moving to Memphis. The family left Memphis and boarded themselves inside of the plantation house when the 1878 yellow fever epidemic struck. The measure may have seemed drastic to others, but Mr. Angevine understood the toll of yellow fever better than most. His wife had died of the fever the previous summer. As far as the servant could see, the front door was locked and the flies seemed to have the only access to the house. He pried open the shutters and broke the glass, letting loose a plume of repugnant air. In the stale, dark rooms, he saw the corpses of the Angevine family, many in advanced stages of decomposition. Even in the darkness, he could see their yellow skin, the color of unpolished brass. Mary Louisa, the eldest, had been the first to go, and 5 others had followed. No one can really imagine those final days in the fever-ridden house. The fever attacked each person in the Angevine family until none were well enough to help the others. It hit suddenly, in the form of a piercing headache and painful sensitivity to light, like looking into a white sun. At that point, the patient could still hope that it was not yellow fever, but the pain worsened, crippling movement and burning the skin. The fever rose to 104, maybe 105 degrees, and bones felt as though they had been cracked. The kidneys stopped functioning, poisoning the body. Abdominal cramps began in the final days of illness, as the patient vomited black blood brought on by internal hemorrhaging. The victim became a palette of hideous color. Red blood ran from the gums, eyes, and nose. The tongue swelled, turning purple. Black vomit roiled, and the skin grew a deep gold, the whites of the eyes turning brilliant yellow. The day before yesterday, as I speak these words to you on the morning of January 24th, Dr. Kirk Milhone, a pediatric cardiologist who was picked by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to head up the government's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. These are the guys who keep saying childhood vaccination should be optional after consultation with your doctor or your conscience or the Reddit board of your choice, said on a podcast. Said podcast called Why Should I Trust You? Which is a hell of a question, actually. Quote, when we talk about the risk of, let's say, measles, many of those risks of not getting measles without having a vaccine was in the 1960s. We take care of children much differently now. What we're going to have is a real-world experience of when unvaccinated people get measles. What is the new incidence of hospitalization? What's the incidence of death? Pardon my language, but motherfucker, we know. There's no need for you to take a generation of children and adults, for that matter, and subject them to a potentially serious disease, measles or any other, to satisfy your curiosity when we can just prevent it to begin with. I don't like established science, he said, adding, science is what I observe. Asshole. Science didn't start when the opening credits rolled on your life. All these other people lived and died of these diseases and did the research about them, so you didn't have to. Not to mention all their years of debate and argument and disputation was an advantage because it washed out the very subjectivity which you claim as a privilege. You know how long American doctors believed in healthy pus? You can hear the quotation marks, right? Decades after Europe realized that, no, that's what you call an infection. That's what you call someone who's under attack by bacteria. No such thing. How long American women kept dying of, quote, childbed fever, which was not so much a transmissible disease, but the result of doctors sticking their unwashed hands, their dirty fingernails, inside of them during childbirth. They kept believing those things after objective research had told them that they were not true, and in fact, they were murdering their bloody patients. But they also said, science is what I observe, and I think the dirt under my fingernails is pretty cool, thank you very much. That and some received wisdom, and they were on their way, because guess what? Until fairly recently, medical schools didn't even use cadavers. Doctors went out into the field never having seen the inside of a patient. It was all magical thinking, but we got past that, in part because a whole lot of guys in laboratories, suddenly I'm British, laboratories, were experimenting with electron microscopes and culturing bacteria, growing viruses, sometimes not in such a good way, we've heard rumors about that, and asking how do these things really work at a very basic level beyond the level that any one person can see. How many accumulated lifetimes of knowledge did this one ignorant jerk just devalue in favor of his own limited fund of knowledge? Even Isaac Newton said, I stand on the shoulder of giants, because all of these philosophers and scientists and mathematicians, and yeah, the odd alchemist, went ahead of him. He built off of what they did. Think about what would happen if every scientist had the same attitude as this guy. Every single person would have to start their education by discovering fire, by inventing the wheel. That's not how we progress through time. You can even see this in baseball. Before we had splits, going back to the turn of the 20th century, some managers were noticing, based on, what they saw, that some players needed to be platooned, that putting up a left-handed hitter against certain left-handed pitchers was a bad idea. But in the absence of the statistics, some other managers denied that that was a real thing. Those managers in subsequent generations who accepted it, however, built on it, and they began to platoon. and thereby gained an advantage on the competition. Yet I can show you when Casey Stengel, one of the daddies of platooning, began managing in the majors in 1934 and talked up platooning, his own general manager, Bob Quinn, said, "Nope, don't believe in it. It's a psychological fad." That's a quote. Now imagine that your favorite team today hired a new manager, and that manager says, "Yeah, I don't believe in platooning. I think we need to re-examine this concept. We need to expose all left-handed hitters to left-handed pitching so we can see if there's really something to this." And somebody, hopefully some small, clear, quiet voice says, "Excuse me, sir, but I've been to Baseball Reference lately, and they've gone back and they've got platooning stats going all the way back to 1900 just about. So there's a population of about 24,000 players, and you can see that it's true to a greater or lesser extent for just about every one of them." And that manager says, "Nope, we've got to run the experiment all over again because I'm not satisfied." You know, this is kind of funny. I went to Baseball Reference just now. I paused the recording. And to the extent that it has complete platoon stats, and they are incomplete going back to the start of the 20th century, but I asked it to combine all plate appearances by left-handed batters over time and split them into left-handed hitter versus left-handed pitcher plate appearances and left-handed hitter versus right-handed pitcher plate appearances. So left-handed hitters going back to 1912, that's what it's giving me, have had 4.9 million plate appearances against right-handed pitching, and they have had a 756 OPS. That's across all of time, or most of it, since modern baseball began. We have this arbitrary modern cutoff at 1900, but this is what we have to work with, so stay with me. Lefties on lefties? Well, the first thing that might jump out at you is that they've had a ton less playing time. They've had only 1.1 million plate appearances. It seems like managers have been holding them out against lefties for some reason. And they had good reason to do that because the OPS, lefty on lefty action, drops by 75 points roughly. They have a 682 OPS, lefty on lefty. Again, left-handed hitter versus right-handed pitcher, 756. Left-handed hitter versus left-handed pitcher, 682. Now, we should still treat every hitter as an individual. Not every single one of them needs to be platooned, but most of them do. Less so when it comes to right-handers facing right-handers. That doesn't affect them as badly for some reason, but it has been well understood for over 100 years that lefties versus lefties are a problem. But no, if the new manager of, say, the Baltimore Orioles was Dr. Milhoan, he'd say, "No, I reject that. I have to see it for myself. I have to rerun the 150-year experiment in this stuff," which would be pathetic. But you know what else? No one would suffer lasting consequences. No one would die from some bug getting out of control in their bodies. Just as all those ball players played baseball so we could take the measure of their accumulated experiences and know more than they did, all these other people, including those victims of yellow fever that I talked about, the 5,000 in Philadelphia in 1793, the 20,000 in the Mississippi Valley in 1878, and on. They lived and died so that we did not have to live and die in the same manner that they did. If there were any justice, their ghosts really would walk because we are ungrateful. This fellow, this so-called doctor, thinks that getting vaccinated has to be an individual decision or we have been deprived of liberty. Wait until this same government starts drafting our young men to invade Venezuela or Greenland. Will those sons and brothers be able to make the individual decision not to go? Can you make an individual decision to drive 110 miles per hour down a 35 mile per hour street as school children cross in front of you? You idiot. The good doctor completely disagrees with the idea of community. I get vaccinated for myself because I don't want to get sick and die, but I also get vaccinated for you because I don't want you to catch something from me. In that way, to borrow from polio victim Franklin Roosevelt, we quarantine the assholes. Scott over there doesn't want to get vaccinated, wants to catch a severe case of COVID, has his life destroyed by long COVID, wants to give the measles a spin for a novelty. Well, fine, go ahead. But me, I'm going to bounce it. And so is the rest of my family. and we'll stand at the graveside and laugh at you. The last major outbreak of yellow fever in the continental United States was in 1905. All the swamps had been drained by then. That was the one that struck when Clyde Milan was playing at Clarksville, but not that Clarksville. They knew about the mosquitoes by then, but there was still nothing for it but to cancel the baseball season. The North Texas League shut down and sent the players home. Those players caught the first train from Clarksville and didn't come back. There aren't even any stats. In their panic, they just threw everything out and skedaddled. It turned out to be not such a big deal in the life and career of Clyde Milan. The next year, he got to start over with the Wichita Jobbers of the Western Association. Great name. But for 1,000 or so Americans who had succumbed to the disease, there would be no second chances. Milan scored 1,004 runs in the major leagues. We might think of that as one tally for each person who died of yellowjack. Hey, before we go, I should mention that I and a number of my Baseball Prospectus colleagues, as well as pals like David Roth, have been fortunate enough to be nominated for a Sabre Analytics Conference Research Award for 2026. I'll talk about this more next week, but if you Google that up, you can see how to read my piece Every Day They Burn the Book. It's open to all, even non-subscribers to Baseball Prospectus, and if you feel like it, I hope you vote for me. Should you wish to follow me in a nice way, I mean, on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there remains a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook and search on Infinite Inning. Most recently, I put up a picture of William Bell's false accuser and his murderer. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. As I've said throughout the episode, Dead Player of the Day Series 2 awaits, gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, I'm running out of time. Try to make the theme music last longer. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who reminds you that it's okay. It's the sweet, susurrant sound of the snow falling that you're hearing, not every individual flake laughing at you. Well, I admit I've had that thought, but not since junior high school gym class, and if I can just get it out of my head, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.